Mr. Bianconi, you are nominated to the European Poet of Freedom Award. What does it mean, freedom in poetry for you? Because it's a very general idea and very general word, I guess. Very, it has a lot of meanings. And for you in the poetry, what does it mean? You think about freedom when you write poetry, or you read poetry, or you do something with poetry?
Yes, I definitely think poetry has a lot to do with freedom. In some paradoxical ways, for example, I believe that poetry has very strict ways of functioning, and in these strict ways lies its freedom in a way. You know, you have metrical rules, you have forms, you have a tradition which is still very present in the present time, and all of these constrictions, I think, are a big freedom because they free you from the fetters of the self, a lot of little struggles of your little soul that try to assert itself, and actually merging with this larger set of rules and historical influences. This helps you to free yourself from your little preoccupation and the little struggles of your day-to-day reality, and that's a great freedom. Another element that I think is very relevant for what concerns freedom in poetry is its attention to language. I find that other literary forms like mainstream forms like the novel or such thing, they have to follow a plot or a character dimension that very easily fall into cliche. Meanwhile, poetry seems to be a finer instrument that follows the word and the sound within each syllable and the rhymes between one and the other syllable and the other word. And this, in a way, is kind of a fine-tuning instrument that allows poetry to with the risk of solipsism sometimes, but allows it to be freer from from the cliche, from commonplaces that I think that other dimension of the writing of literary forms can very easily fall into.
Okay, actually now I would like to ask you about different aspects of freedom, about political freedom. Because from the translations of your poem we've read, we know that you've been occupied with also current political situation. How do you find this kind of actuality in poetry important? I mean mostly your poems about situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
I think this is, in a way, is a direct consequence of what I was trying to say so far, because this escaping the cliches, escaping the rhetoric of a pre-digested discourse, you can try and say something, and that's why I think that it is important that poetry deals with what is happening in the world. It's also very difficult though, because poetry tends to be, in a way, a human voice. You know, the line, the black of the line on the page, is always dealing with this big chunk of white on the other side of the page. You know, and that can be seen as time, can be seen as rhetoric, can be seen as the discourse of power. And so for poetry, it's quite hard to make wide political discourse, I think. But what poetry is good at is perhaps to counterbalance this discourse. You know, many poets, many Polish poets, for example, Herbert or Miłosz, they have been, Herbert above all, been so amazing, you know, in giving lessons about keeping your tone down but your conscience up, in a way, you know, not buying into any of the rhetoric of power, you know, learning from what has been and all these kind of things. And so I think the poets must have a special tool to deal with the political situation, and but at the same time it's a very tricky, is a trap in a way, because that goes against poetry, no? So you can keep it very personal, you can talk about the history of a single person. It's harder to address wider political situation, because then you need to generalize, you need to simplify, and you're becoming rhetorical, and you're buying into the cliche. And this is the opposite of poetry. So it's a very fine but necessary balance.
Would you describe yourself as an optimist, as a optimistic poet? Because in your poetry, there's this belief that poetry can maybe not save, but can make world a little better place. It's very. It maybe sounds naive, but it's not. I guess it's this feeling about poetry that the poetry can change something, that can change communication between people. Do you agree with this? Because I think it's somewhere in your poetry. I can see it. I don't know if it's true.
I'm glad you feel like that, because I don't know if I do believe it. In certain moments I do believe it. And then the next moment I don't believe it any longer. So if that belief, that fortunate moment where I do believe it, stays in my poetry, it's a very great thing. And a great poet like Auden said, poetry makes nothing happen. So we know it. But in certain moments we forget, and we kind of believe we can make something happen. If that stays in the poem, well, that's great news. I'm glad.
Yeah, because in one of your poems, you said that poetry is like a preparing of the picture. It's a canvas, like a canvas. It's like a white space on the picture where anything can happen. So it's like a meta space, like something which brings us, which allows us to create some story or some. It's a space of communication, I guess. It's the poetry can, I guess, in your case, it's like this tool to make things happen. I would say like this.
Yeah, totally. To allow things to happen. So poetry doesn't make anything happen, but you can stay attuned to when things will happen and to be true to them. You know. What Herbert says, be faithful, go. It's always, this is the moment at the end of the envoy of Mr. Cogito, when there is this moment where be faithful, go. You're always on the verge of something to happen, and poetry can just prepare you to be true to that moment. Then it will not help you and will not change anything, but it's like Hamletic readiness is all. You're going to be true, you're going to listen carefully to what is happening in the world. You will not simplify things, you will not take shortcuts, you will not find any simplistic solution. You're going to keep listening and you're going to be true. When things going to happen to you, you're going to do your best. And again, like Herbert says, you've been chosen. There was nobody better than you. So there is this sense. You're not going to make things better, but you're going to try. And poetry helps you not to lose this preparation, I believe.
So actually you've mentioned Herbert already twice before. How about other Polish poets? Do you actually read a lot of Polish poetry?
Yes, I do, especially the big ones. So I don't mention him again, but we know him. Miłosz and Szymborska and Różewicz and Zagajewski. The new generation is different. Sure. So I tried to read quite a lot what I found in translation. I found some very good poets, but what happened in Poland in the previous generation is something I think is comparable to the Augustian poets, in 50 years you have Virgil and Horace and Ovid, and what happened in Poland is crazy. So it's quite hard for the new generation, for the actual generation to deal with such a past, but at the same time I think it's amazing what happened there, and it's a great richness. Perhaps after a moment of shock, when you start dealing with what those poets have created, I think is a incredible richness you have here in Poland. Unparalleled anywhere in the world, I would think. So I do love Polish poetry.
Okay, then the next question has to follow. As you're not only a poet but also a translator, how do you feel about translating poems? Because actually, when you're reading poems of Polish poets, you're reading probably something a bit different than what we know. So how do you work with translating poetry?
So here there are a few questions in one. One thing, reading those Polish poets we mentioned, there is an impression that I don't know if it's correct or maybe horribly wrong, but that they're so imbued with meaning, and they manage, and I'm thinking more of Herbert and Szymborska than Miłosz, but they manage to solve some of the mysteries of life and put them down on paper. And so, in a way, it's poetry more than other poetry is quite related to the meaning, and so a lot can be translated. That's my impression with some of them, as opposed to other kind of poetry that are much more formal and rhythmical. Perhaps they have all these qualities, but I have the impression that there is something very measured and very understandable. It's like a poetry of thought, in a way, more than a poetry of music. And but then poetry is a mix of all these things. I usually translate from languages that I know, but sometimes I do not. Sometimes I do translate from languages I do not know. And for example, looking for what was happening in Poland, I took part in a project where we translated 6 Swiss Italian poets, translated 6 Polish young poets, and we looked for a lingua franca, for a language that we had in common. That can seem like an abomination, that you don't understand what you're translating from, but fact is we had the language of poetry in common. Many times the translator knows Polish, but it's not a poet, so it doesn't know. There is a set of rules that he doesn't know, which is linguistic rules anyway. And so this experiment was pretty nice, and I translated poems by Joannę Wajs, and she's a very good translator from Italian into Polish. So she prepared interlinear translations, so a rough translation. And when I first read them, I said, these are good poems. What can I do? Well, I can change this little comma. I can change, we'll change this. And starting to change little details, the poem started to generate its own necessity, and I changed more and more and more and more. And to the point, and that was a fantastic surprise when I spoke to Joanna. I said, here I changed, you weren't saying this, but I changed it this way and this way. In some occasions she said, this is what I meant. So without having any access to the original, in a way the necessity of the poet itself, the poem itself, pushed me to understand what she was doing. And that was a great confirmation of some of these theories.
Thank you very much for the conversation, and we hope we have crossed fingers about your nomination to the European Poet of Freedom. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.